I had intended to get up here and say I was enthusiastic to talk to you about the results of this project. But since all my slides are data and no pictures, I'm a little intimidated now. But, sorry about that. So we'll go ahead now anyway. So we'll take a look at some data. So I want to say a couple things that why I think this is an interesting or should be worth some interest is, one, it's a spin-off out of conversations that we had at these meetings. So there were 4 REU PIs sitting around, and we had a bunch of questions that we wanted to answer about the larger pool of applicants. We all knew what was going on in our own REUs, but we didn't know how our REUs compared to other REUs, and we weren't quite sure how to go about doing that. So the 4 of us did sort of a little secret pilot where we all shared our data, and we couldn't present it to anybody because we didn't have IRB approval to release the data. But we did have a chance to take a look at it ourselves and see that this was something that was feasible to do. And so we ran a pilot project to try to collect this data for the whole community. I think the second reason that it's interesting is it's data that we haven't seen before. So what we're going to take a look at is what the applicant pools look like across OCE, EAR, and AGS. And we're also going to get to see in a little bit of detail how that breaks down across various groups. I will say as a caveat at the very beginning, it is only 10 sites that were able to participate. So we do have to take this all with a grain of salt because of the amount of data that's available. So the questions that we wanted to take a look at were these. One, we wanted to know who's looking for an internship in geo-funded REUs. We wanted to know how many duplicate applications are in the applicant pool. This one was actually very important to us, especially around the issues of diversity. We didn't know, is there 1 minority student applying to 10 REUs, or are there 10 minority students applying to 10 REUs? We had no way to tell, so we weren't sure how we could count our data, and whether we as a community could feel good about our efforts to recruit and attract and retain these students or not. We wanted to say, how does the applicant pool compare to the selected interns? So are we meeting goals? Are the policies that are in place being effective? And we also wanted to get into this idea of prior research experience, because some of the directorates have policies about prior research experience. We wanted to see what the students were coming in with, how common that was, that sort of thing. So I want to start off by saying thank you to everybody who responded. Everybody didn't meet all of the steps in the process, but I did get a good response from the community. There were, at the time of the project, there were 58 funded REU sites. 10 of them were able to provide me with all the data to contribute to the complete set. 6 of those sites were OCE sites, 3 were EAR sites, and 1 was AGS, just to give you a breakdown of how we looked across all of the geo-funded REUs. So the types of data that we were collecting, we collected 2 types. So the first type we collected was sample data, where we had individual students who were opting to participate in the project. And that was anonymized data, so we didn't collect their names, but we did collect enough information that we could track individuals across the pool, which was important for seeing whether or not we had duplicate applications, even though we didn't have their names. The other type of data that we collected was population data. And this is data that was reported by the REU site in a number of demographic categories. So tell us how many applicants you had in various categories as an aggregate so we can compare. The third thing that I wanted to test that initially wasn't one of the questions we were trying to answer was around how best to collect this data for the community. And so you can see we had a minimum site participation here of 10.4% and 100% at other sites, and that had to do with the way we actually collected the data. So the maximum participation rates were at sites where we had opt-out policies in place for the for the consent forms, and so students were opting out at a very low rate. At this site, due to a number of reasons, some sites don't have it's not easy for them to change the questions they can ask. It's not easy for them to put a waiver consent form into their application process. I sent them a link, which they then sent out to the applicants afterwards and said, we think you should consider participating in this study. So when we did it that way, we had a very low participation rate. But overall, we had about a little over 50% of the population participate for a total sample size of 827 applicants and a population of just over 1,600. So to answer this first question, who's looking for an internship? Not surprisingly, it turned out that most of the students were juniors. We had the next largest group was sophomores, freshmen, seniors, and some that didn't have responses or irrelevant responses were included in that category. This is looking at once we corrected for unique-only applications, so we don't have duplicates showing into this grouping. I will give a caveat that this turns out to be across different REU sites. This is a difficult thing to track. You wouldn't think that it would be, but everybody's asking about this in very different ways. And so putting the data together turned out to be problematic. And it becomes even more problematic when you start counting community college students in, because they have how they report themselves, how they see themselves, first year, second year, third year, turns out to be a little challenging. So one of my requests for the community comes up around this question. It would be really nice as a community if we could find a common way to ask this item, which would allow easy cross-comparison from all of our sites. And it shouldn't be that hard, but if people are you a rising sophomore, which is which level did you just compete? I mean, there's all different ways. We just have to come to some consensus to make it easier and some of the assumptions to go down. So the one that I know you're probably all interested in, who was looking for an internship? Well, primarily it's white women that were looking for an internship. Not surprising. The second largest group was white men. GNC stands for gender nonconforming. So we had small numbers of those across several demographic categories. Underrepresented females were the third largest group. Underrepresented males, then Asian females and Asian males. And then some that also chose not to respond or didn't give complete responses. Question?
How did you control for the multiple box checkers?
So multiple box checkers were handled in a couple of different ways. One way that I controlled for that was I created a category called underrepresented. So if you check that you fell into a minority status, then you fell into underrepresented minorities here. So that's why one of the reasons why I didn't break this out into African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, because if you check that you were African American and white and Pacific Islander, you fell into underrepresented category. And so that was one of the ways that I handled that. So again, I would say this is another place where we could consider going to a more standard way to ask these questions. So NSF has to report these data using guidance that's provided by OMB. And so they have set structures for asking these kinds of race and ethnicity questions. They usually encourage the two-part item, where you ask race as one item, ethnicity as a separate item, similar to what's done on the census. And so I would encourage the community to look at some of these models and come up with one way to ask this item, because again, my student and I had to do a little bit of finagling with the data to sort of get it into these categories. And the other place it comes up is around gender. So again, I would encourage something like, I'll propose this. Some people have strong opinions about this, and we can talk a little bit more about what might be better, but a three-choice item kind of works well from what the feedback I've gotten from students who've completed our application. Male, female, and I prefer to describe my gender differently, or some small variant thereof seems to work. But again, the point is we can collect data and we can do things with the data if we're getting good data. And so we may have to make a few trade-offs in order to get good data to allow us to compare as a community. Well, we may have some trade-offs about, I've seen the question was what sort of trade-offs might we make? I've seen the gender item asked in a way that offers 6 choices. Okay, you can include lots of different things there. You are being more inclusive by offering a box to which they may identify. But then you begin to get into this scenario of having to predict all these sorts of options out there. And it may not be worth the value of that if you can't then combine the data. Or maybe we go to 6 checkboxes as a community. I personally don't have a strong opinion about which one it is, but rather that we all go across. So.
Sorry, not to be the social scientist again, but if you, and Carolyn, you correct me if I'm wrong, you're the diversity specialist, but if she's here, yeah, I've used in the past, there's actually a lot of advice online from the logo of the organization is the equal sign. I'm sorry, it escapes me from the Human Rights Organization. They have a lot of advice on how to choose certain questioning structures like that and why you might use those and why you might not. So I would, that would be my suggestion is folks take a look at some of those sites and have a look at those options. And because there are some considerations about what limitations too much questioning and too little can create.
Exactly. Yeah. So the point here is a conversation about it and coming to some sort of consensus, I think, as a community would benefit us. So yes, there are lots of options and places we can look. So again, I do want to offer a little bit of caution about this data. So when we look and we compare the sample to the population, we do see some places where we have over-participation. So women, for example, participated in the study at a higher rate. And we had Hispanic or Latinos participating in the study at a slightly higher rate. So we do need to use a little bit of caution when we look at this data, especially around the female participation. Sure. So sample in this case were people who opted in, again, to participate in the study. So there are sample. The population was the aggregate data that the REU sites provided about everybody who applied. So we have both to be able to compare. So around gender, we were, the populations were definitely different. When we compared around race, the two populations could be identical. And when we compared around ethnicity, it was very, very close, but I think it was slightly outside of being a comparable population. So we want to try to put this in some sort of broader perspective. So I took a look at some of the data that's collected by AGI. And so here, in 2014, for example, the diversity within geoscience departments was around 11%. Within our applicant pool, we had about 20.4% underrepresented minorities in the applicant pool for geo overall. So that's certainly a good thing. Now, granted, this is 2014 data. It might have gone up some, but I would say it's probably still below what we're looking at here. Some of that may also be, though, because we include OCE sites. And OCE sites draw bio students in sometimes. We also are getting into other pools besides geoscience departments, so we could use other benchmarkers that we may want to look at. Participation of women. So this is a busy plot by AGI. They're looking at all different sort of degree categories. The one that you want to focus on here is blue. So this solid blue line shows BS enrollments for women in geoscience departments. And in 2015, this was about 40%. Meanwhile, women comprised about 64% of the applicant pool across of all the geo REU applications. So again, we're doing a little bit above this particular benchmark, though there may be some other benchmarks that we may want to keep an eye on. So this slide, I think, is a really important slide to take a look at. This is showing only OCE sites. And the reason I chose only OCE sites was I could get data for blue bars are showing the ratio of students that were accepted into OCE sites. And the orange bars in this case are now showing the ratio of the sample of OCE sites that were available. And so you can see in this that we are accepting Hispanic or Latino or Latina applicants at a higher rate than they are represented in the applicant pool. You can see the same thing for African American as well as Native American participants. And so that's a good thing. I think that shows that the policies that are in place are influencing the way our programs are operating. We are seeing participation at rates higher than we are seeing in the applicant pool, which is good. The one place that I see a little bit of concern is around the participation of Asians in our programs. So as we look at the total percent of the population that they represent in the applications, they actually are a very, very small percent of the overall applications, but they're not getting the same treatment that Hispanic or Latino or Latinas are getting or African Americans are getting in the actual selection process. So we as a community may want to consider how we view Asian Americans when we're taking a look at making our acceptances, because I think we may be leaving them behind a little bit, but that's something that we could certainly talk about. I think the other thing that this slide brought to light for me, and it's a little bit of I think it's putting myself out a little bit to say this, but if I'm reflecting on this a bit of myself, and I'm one of these underrepresented minority students, I think this slide makes me a little bit uncomfortable in that I might want a little bit of reassurance that I'm in the program because I really got into the program. And so, I don't know. This is something that I felt when I looked at it, and I tried to think about it from an alternative perspective. But maybe I'm way off base, and this is something that we can talk about. But I think it is something that we may want to be mindful of as a community. And then we did the same thing for gender. So we can again see within OC, this is only OCE data, we can see that in the orange bars, males are being accepted at a rate higher than they appear in the application pool. So that is a good thing. That is showing that the policies that OCE is putting in place to encourage the acceptance of males is definitely kind of panning out. And so that's a good thing. So how many multiple applications across REU sites are there? This was a very surprising result for me. So we had a total of 827 applications. 769 of those were unique. That means only 54 students applied to 2 or more sites, which was surprising. Most of them applied to 2 sites in the sample that we had, so the number of sites that were participating. And so those broke down by about 8% of duplicants in OCE and about 4% in, I'm sorry, that should be EAR on that slide. So that's a really low number. I think that the reality is this is probably a little bit higher. It has to do with the sample that we had. We only had 6 OCE sites to potentially detect applications in. But I do think that it's maybe not as high as we've sort of heard anecdotally from some students that it is. And so that's a little concerning in terms of the number of slots that are available, especially when you see the data on the selectivity of the programs. We're already pretty selective as it is. So that's a little bit of something to keep an eye on as we continue to collect more data. So who's submitting these applications? It's white women. They are submitting the most duplicate applications, and that is followed by white men, although I would note that white women and Asian females are both overrepresented in this group compared to their representation in the application pool overall. But we did want to get a sort of sense of this. And again, this is only a sample of 54 in this case, so it's a pretty small number. But it is interesting at least to get a sense of who might be sending these multiple applications. We wanted to take a look at prior research experience. So overall, we found this was a self-report item. So how many had prior research experience? About 60% reported having prior research experience. We wanted to find out when that occurred. So most of them reported this being part-time academic year prior research experience. A small amount reported sort of summer full-time academic or research experience. And a couple didn't respond to this final question. We also asked them, and I don't have the data in this set, about was their research NSF funded? And not surprisingly, the students weren't very sure about that. They really didn't have an answer. And I didn't include it because I didn't really put a lot of stock in it when I saw the data. So it didn't seem too meaningful. But I did want to see how this broke down by division. So OCE, about 60%. So that held with OCE, which was also the largest number of sites. For EAR, it was about 28%. And for AGS, also about 28% having prior research experience when they applied to the program. We wanted to break this out then by demographics. So we found that majority students tended to have about 58% of 58 of them had prior research experience. Underrepresented minority students, about 45% had prior research experience. And about 73% of Asian students tended to have prior research experience when applying. And so again, this is almost a double whammy in some cases, depending on the way that our selection process is working. right? If we are not if they're not getting the benefit of being an underrepresented population and they have lots of research experience coming in, our selection processes may be not pushing them forward into the final group of being accepted. For women, again, about 60% of women had prior research experience. Men had slightly less. And for gender other or gender non-conforming, we had about 66% of those students having prior research experience. But again, this is a very small number of students. Yep. Oh, they're flipped. Yeah, those columns are switched. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question here.
Thank you.
I want to know how you define the prior research experience. Do you ask these questions specifically in the application form, or you figure out based on the answers for the essay or essay questions?
No. So we're asking them directly, do they consider themselves to have prior research experience?
So you don't define what should be considered as prior research experience, because often the time when I see my applications, some students, they're not so sure. They just try to list out that they believe these are the research experience. So.
Yes, it's a good point, and that's a great question. And so again, I think what this point isn't, the point of this is to suggest that there's a lot more opportunity for doing more. So seeing how students reflect on prior research experience is actually a good question. I've had lots of students that I've interacted with where they've described their prior research experience, and then I start hearing about it, and it turns out that it's bottle washing in the lab or really mundane sample prep, which may or may not count. And then when it comes down to are we selecting them with prior research experience or not, how do you handle that? So I think that prior research experience, this gives us a little bit of a flavor of what may be going on in some areas that we could probe more deeply about what do these students actually internalize as the meaning of prior research experience. So it's a good question and a good point. Thank you.
I am so psyched to see this data for two reasons. One of them, without having much overlap in the REU programs, it suggests to me that our individual REU programs are unique and might be attracting unique aspects or our unique aspects are attracting specific students to those programs. The other thing is that it should be fodder for NSF to go and say, look, 5% of all those people, since there's very little overlap and they are unique applicants, there's 5% of the people that want to do these research experiences are getting funded to do them. And we're greatly underserving the student population that's out there. And it's just great. It's great initial, even as it is now, it's powerful data.
I think this is great data, and I'm really excited to see it. I've heard about it for a while, so I'm excited to see that this is come through. I guess I have a little bit of question. So you've got 10 sites. Looks like you had a total potential pool of 1,600, which is an average of 160. Now, how balanced were those 10 in the size of them, and also the size of the pool that ultimately they're selecting is something to consider? Because there are some sites, I'm not one of them, but get that many,
right.
Get 769 applicants
sure.
in a given year. And so, it can skew those numbers and balances depending upon where they are.
Absolutely.
And where they're located, all those things. I know it's 10, you're limited, this is still great data, but we need to have a little bit of caution about how much we interpret this and move forward, other than to say that we really need to have more of this.
Yes.
That's more complete.
Agreed. And I think that that's exactly the point of this, is to say we as a community need to be doing more to share data across our sites. I think that it can help us not just in things like applications, but it can help us in terms of things like, and this is going to come up in the next session that we're going to talk about in terms of evaluation, but things like there was a question that came up earlier in the workshop about the value of writing workshops. And that shouldn't just be a debate of opinion. That should be a debate of effectiveness, and we have people who are equipped to help us answer those questions. We need to be sharing data. How effective are writing workshops is something that we should be able, we should have data to show that sort of thing. So that's just two sort of extremes that I'm picking, but the point is share data. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So again, I wanted to benchmark this to try to put the prior research question into some sort of context. So again, this is data collected from AGI. This is the number of research experiences for graduating geoscience seniors. And the blue column is the one you want to pay attention to here. This is the BAs and BSs. So at graduation, just over 25% have no prior research experience. So that means 75% of graduating geoscience majors have some prior research experience. That kind of fits what we're seeing in terms of the applicant data. 60+ % having coming to us with some sort of prior research experience. So it's clearly a very common thing that students that may be applying to our pools are going to be coming to us with some prior research experience. So the final thing that I want to give a plug for is the folks at Mathematica. So I know that we're going to hear a little bit more about this. But again, this is a longitudinal tracking system where the data will be collected. We will be able to compare it. If you are eligible to participate in this, I would strongly encourage you to participate in the pilot. My understanding is that it's EAR that has an opportunity to participate within GEO. So it's important that we do more to share data and create sort of community slides like this, community data sets like this that we can all use. Because this can help us benchmark our recruiting, benchmark all kinds of efforts that we want to experiment with.